I would like to welcome you to Francis Marion University. My name is Linda Sullen, and I am a co-chair of the Hewn Timber Cabin Committee. I would like to thank Dr. Fred Carter, Mrs. Carter, and the administration of Francis Marion University for making this presentation possible. I would also like to thank the Hewn Timber Cabin Committee for all the work that you've done and all the work that you're still doing to pave the path from the cabins to the university. We say thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce one of our very own. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Tuskegee Institute and a Master of Arts degree in Library Science from the University of Michigan. In 2007, she retired as a reference librarian and a professor emerita from the James A. Rogers Library at Francis Marion University. She is a founding member of the FMU African American Faculty and Staff Coalition. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Ms. Yvette Pierce.
I would like to say good evening to all of you. This is indeed a pleasure for me to be here before you. And I was really honored, and I want to thank Dr. Carter again and members of the administration, and also the Hewn Timber Cabins Committee, and members of the African American, Francis Marion African American Faculty Staff Coalition for this opportunity. The presentation that you will see here this evening, oh, excuse me. I hope everybody heard me. The presentation will be based on a narrative that I wrote last year, and I found it to be very informative. A lot of times there is not an appreciation for the accomplishments that our ancestors made. And even when we think about the existence of the Hewn Timber Cabins, there has been much concern over their existence on the campus. For me, to do a work on this project was very informative. It was very enlightening. It gave me an opportunity to learn more about us and the accomplishments that we have made. In so many instances, when we hear about enslavement, we are moved for the most part by sensationalism that we see on TV. Very seldom is there enough emphasis on the accomplishments that our people made. For me, this project was, as I said, very informative, very enlightening. And as you're here this evening with us, I hope that you will feel the same way. With the introduction, this says a lot about why we need to know our history and why Africans were originally brought to what was at that time referred to as the New World. Enslaved people, as it states here, made significant contributions to the history of not only South Carolina, but also the United States. And as we look at this presentation, we're going to see how so much has changed as a result of enslavement. The history of enslaved people must be shared and it must be understood and appreciated through the existence of two hewn timber cabins that were preserved on this campus. The why and how questions must be answered sufficiently. And as we look at the accomplishments that were made, we must consider everything with an attitude of reverence. With the existence of these cabins, and I'm going to read this, they are links to the enslavement of Africans and African Americans in Mars Bluff, the PD area, and South Carolina. They made significant economic and cultural impacts. Even though the Africans at that time were they suffered from disenfranchisement, dishonor, and disrespect. And even though we talk about the acts of impoverishment, brutality, violence, and hostility, we cannot afford to look at the contributions that were made to land ownership, to ancestral dominance, territorial economics. And then as we look at this presentation, we're going to see how we, Africans and African Americans, influence the shaping of ethical, moral, and constitutional reform, not only in this state, but also in the United States. They, because of what happened, affected statewide and national legislative acts and laws. And they were very instrumental in the reshaping and restructuring of a vanishing landscape. The beginnings. Why were Africans brought here from their native lands or countries? We will see that they first came here in Charlestown or either Georgetown because of the ports that were located there. And they came from, as it states here, the windward coast of Africa, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and also Liberia. When we look at this, we have to consider the fact that there was a reason that they came from this part of Africa. And basically it was because of the skills that they had. And as with that last part, it says that with the productivity of crops and them coming into what was considered the New World, there was a clear majority of Africans in South Carolina. 65% of Africans were in this state. Reasons: cheap labor. When we consider the fact that they came here to South Carolina, there were indentured servants and there were also Indians. But why then were Africans brought here to the New World? Basically, because, yes, cheap labor, and also because of the skills and abilities that they had. In the beginning, as we look at what was going on, and even with my experience after having written the narrative that this presentation is based on, large amounts of land were given to landowners based on petitions, grants, and warrants. Okay, they were brought here for crop profitability and also productivity. You had all of these people who were able to come here and work. And when we talk about work, we also have to think about the fact that they were the producers of crops. They did the work. The first crop, well, even though it's the last point, sugarcane was initially thought to have been a major cash producing crop, but it failed. So we have the cultivation of rice. And then, as I said, when we look at the parts of Africa from which they came, they were very skilled and knowledgeable. Once the Africans and us were brought here, we are going to see what is listed here as the perils of enslavement, in the sense that they were treated as property. So along with that, you have forced labor. With them coming here, they were treated very inhumanely. They were stripped of their dignity and of their identity. They were denied freedom, land ownership, and also this was continued through the wills and our estates of the slave owners. So when we talk about control and bondage, those persons who were brought here were not allowed to maintain their identity. And as you will see right here, they were given names by their owners. And this was based on various spellings of their country names, Christian or anglicized European names, and also Hebrew names, biblical names. As I was writing and researching this, I found it to be very interesting, because a lot of times there are traditions that we have that we are not aware of. And that's why it is so very necessary to understand, to know history. In so many instances, especially with the younger generation, there seems to be a lack of concern about where or how we originated. When I looked at some of the names that were given to the enslaved, I was able to just look at how, even though we did not recognize the fact, a lot of their customs and traditions are still following us. And that is one reason we need to know and we need to understand from whence we have come. So when we understand from whence we have come or where we have come, we know where we are going. And sometimes, even as people, we demoralize what happened to our ancestors, but we don't realize how much we have carried on traditions that we don't know the origins. So that's why it is so very necessary for us to know our history. It is necessary for us to understand history. And especially as this presentation is based on this region, it is based on the existence of two hewn timber cabins that so many people are opposed to the existence here. But why? Is the understanding that is needed available? Do we take the time to learn, to understand? So if there's not an understanding, we can't reverence the sacrifices that were made and are still being made. As I said, with the existence of the Hewn Timber Cabins and what they represent, they are links. And one of the points that I made was that it was about land dominance. And I guess this is the instructor part of me in the sense of, I would ask, how many of you know how this campus came to be? You know the existence of it. Do you know the grounds on which do you understand the grounds on which we're seated right now? But even when we think about the PD area, there were struggles, there were sacrifices that were made. So when we know that, instead of frowning upon, I have to say that slavery, the enslavement of people was brutal. It was not right. It was horrible. But then we have to recognize the fact that they were able to endure. They were, I'm going to, right here we're looking at the family that for this area, the Greggs and the Wallace family of the old Marion district. And one thing that I discovered in working on this project, it taught me a lot about the history of South Carolina. Now, as I look around, I don't know, I won't guess anybody's age, but when I was in school, there was so much that I did not get. And then when we were in school, another thing was we learned enough to make good grades. But there's more to history than good grades. There is an understanding that is necessary and appreciation. Now, I did this in a matter of months. But what I realized as I was doing it, now I understand and I can appreciate people who take years, it takes a lifetime, because I had to keep myself focused, because what I didn't know, I wanted to know. I wanted to understand. I wanted to appreciate what was done in terms of surviving, torture, violence. And even when we think about the lives of enslaved people, as I said, they endured much. So the fact that they paved the way for us to be here, for us to even be on this campus, Dr. Carter, says a lot, a lot. And that's why, as I said, we should be at a place where, yes, we honor our ancestors. We reverence the struggles that they made. Okay, I mentioned in this area, the family that, for the most part, had most of the land was the Gregg. Let me go back to this. The Gregg family. And then you can see as we look at the lineage that it began in 1732. 1732. And then this brings us up to the present in terms of how Francis Marion came to be and how they were given land. As I say that, we see the Wallace Gregg Farm Plantation, and the primary owner during this time, if we think about the president's home, that was originally the home of J. Eli Gregg. And from that, we see with him coming here and the plantation farm being created, that the enslaved population built 8 hewn timber cabins. Now, my question could be, how did they live? Where did they live before these 8 cabins were built? I could say, tell me, can you tell me? That they lived in what, huts. They lived in huts. So when and they were pole huts that were, the tops were clay, and they were trenches. But when we look at the fact that when we consider not only in South Carolina, but the 13 original colonies that were considered to be slave states, that you have a population of people who say, no, this is not good enough for us, that we will build homes. If we can do it for someone else, why can't we do it for ourselves? So when we look at the techniques that were used in terms of them even building these hewn timber cabins, right now there are only 2 that are still in, well, 2 that are still in existence here on this campus, and they are on the historic register. What we have here is one of the original cabins, and it was occupied by Archie and Catherine Waiters. And with that, because the Waiters and the Greggs family lived in these cabins until the 1950s, rooms were added onto the original structures. Now, as I was saying previously, when we look at who these enslaved people were, the accomplishments that were made, they were producers of wealth. When we think about crops and the productivity, who did the work? Who did the work? So they were producers of wealth for other people. When I wrote this, when I started writing, when I found myself traveling different places, I tried, in my mind, I was envisioning the large acreages of land that was given to people. And sometimes, in order to understand, we need to visualize some things that were occurring. So if we go back to the 1700s and before, what did you have? you had uncultivated land. So when you think about the fact that enslaved people cleared this land, they came here. What did they possess? What tools did they have? So that goes to say, yes, they had to clear forests. So that's why we can say that they were taskmasters. They were innovators. And they were also artisans. Because once they built their homes and they knew that they had to exist, what did they do? Did they depend on anyone else? No, they did not. Builders of hewn timber cabins. When we think about our history, and again, if there were some things that if I told you that I remember, you would know my age. But right here where it says, technicians of home medicinal remedies. How many of y'all have ever heard of black snake root? Okay? What was it, black snake roots? There were many medicinal herbs that they came up with, many things that they did because there were no doctors, there were no hospitals. So they learned how to survive. So in surviving, we go to nature. We create home health remedies. And even on top of that, there were no hospitals. So, where were children born? How were they born? Midwives. And you know, when we think about our society today, you know, so many people are going to school to become midwives. But we learned, we survived. So that goes to say what was accomplished. So again, that is why we need to know the history of a land, the people who worked the land, the people who lived the land, not for their own benefits, but for the benefit of others. But they survived. So this is what we need to always consider, even when we think about how horrific, how brutal slavery was and is. And then, as I said, making it personal by looking at where we are now. This space, this time, and the importance of it, and not taking anything or anybody for granted. Keepers of houses while they lived in huts. Okay? And as I said, they were innovators of farming tools and equipment. And if any of you who have not been to the Hewn Timber Cabins want to see what they created, what they made, you need to take a tour so that the understanding will be there. So, yes, we must consider the fact that slavery was brutal, but so much came out of that because of us as a people. Machinery for farm. Who do you think worked the land? Who worked the land? They were the machinery. So that's why we must reverence where they lived, who they were and are. Now, as we talk about the Hewn Timber Cabins, we think about a specific family, and this is Alexander Gregg and his wife. This is his second wife, Florence Henderson Gregg, but his first wife, Emma, had 23 children. So what does that say? 23. But, you know, we can, I'm going to say smile, smirk at that, but what else were they going to do? There was no birth control. But do you know why so many of the enslaved people had so many children? Right, right, okay? So when we look at these, the two Hewn Timber cabins that still exist on the campus, there's one that's called Miss Tina's house, and then there's one that's called Miss Catherine's house. So this is the origin of those keepers of the land, of the houses. What we have here, as I mentioned earlier, there were 8 cabins that were built. And it's not good that we can't get a closer view of exactly where they were located, but you can see the red markings that indicate that they were in the midst of this campus. And even with the narrative that is here, their quarters were located on what was called the street. But the street is not a name that is common to just South Carolina, but in all slave states, they usually will, the location of the slave quarters would be on what is categorized as the street. So as I said, this is one of the empty cabins that still at the time, well, it's still here on at Francis Marion. Okay, the doctrine of enslavement. Why? For economic, social, territorial, and political enslavement caused economic, social, territorial, and political conflict. Because as time progressed, the Northerners were becoming very dissatisfied with what Southerners were doing, even in terms of land rights. Now, I know those of us who are sitting here are aware of our history. And with this, we know that because of the conflict that existed between the North and the South, this led to the beginning of the Civil War. And with that, there were several things that were done against the enslaved population. So we have acts of intimidation, violence, and hostility, the Black Codes, which were attempts to control or manipulate the economic freedom and rights of those who were previously enslaved. All types of actions, violence, were done against people to maintain the status quo. And even as I said, when we think about television, we've heard, and it is real, the acts of the Ku Klux Klan and also the Jim Crow laws. Again, as I was doing this, I got a better understanding of why. Because you want to keep people in subservient positions. You want to maintain a kind of lifestyle that you're accustomed to at the expense of someone else. Out of the Reconstruction of the Civil War, we have Reconstruction. And during this era, several things came into being. What I have right here, and I'm sure most of us have heard about the 40 acres and a mule land that was promised to the freed black people that they never received. And then even an attempt by the South Carolina Land Commission that was supposed to help the freed Africans. But even with that and the Freedmen's Bureau, there was so much corruption. So they did not do what they were intended to do. But during that period of Reconstruction, national laws were passed. The 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. Now, quiz time again. Quiz time again. As a result of this project, I had the opportunity to engage in conversations with many people. What is the 13th Amendment? What did it do?
Abolish slavery.
It,
Abolish slavery.
okay, what is the 14th? What is the 14th? Huh?
Rights as citizens.
I didn't hear you.
It gave the free slave the rights as citizens.
Well, equal protection. Equal protection. And see, that's what I started finding out because, as I said, I started having conversations with people just to know. I said, am I the only one who don't know my history? Am I the only one? And members of my family who are present and others too might say, oh my gosh, she's talking so much. Yes, because I was learning, because I found out that there was information that I did not obtain while I was in school. So we have to take it upon ourselves to come to a place of knowledge, a place of understanding. Now, I know we all know what the 15th Amendment is, right? Huh? Right to vote for black men. 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 So even though accomplishments were made, we still have a long way to go. And we need to understand that. And what I want to say now, you know, there are so many movements that are occurring today. But what are they based on? Is the understanding there? Can we really appreciate that which those who were taken from their homelands, the sacrifices that they made? Can we look at them with honor and respect because of the bravery, because of what they had to endure, and the accomplishments that they made? Okay, now we look at other things that were occurring. We saw some laws and legislative actions that were made. But with Reconstruction, that was not good for a lot of Africans or African Americans. Do you know why? Because they did not own land. They had no identity. They had no place to go. So that's why we found out that a lot of them stayed where they were. They didn't have any choice. They couldn't go anywhere. And the landowners, plantation owners, did what they could do to make sure that they did not acquire or obtain land. So with this, now this is interesting too. Now, I'm sure that we've all heard the term sharecropping and tenant farming. Do we know the significance? Do we know the difference? But at any rate, sharecropping, tenant farming, or wage laborers were not in favor or advantageous for those who were enslaved because they were still without. They had no money. They had no place to go. So therefore, they had to engage in certain activities that were still not profitable for them. Yet, they survived. Now, and this is one thing too, based on conversations. Does sharecropping still exist? Does it still exist? And I was surprised to find out that it does. It does. With that, and I didn't mention this when I was talking about the names that were given people. But when I worked as a librarian here at Francis Marion, I could tell where, as to use that old expression, the neck of the woods from which people came. Because, and some of you probably know the same thing, because I found out that, okay, if you were from Lake City, do you know names that are common to Lake City? Burgesses, Singletaries, whatever, and who? McFadden? Okay, Marion. My goodness, Moody's, Legates. Who? David. But see, that was a way going back to a way of identification, because we did not have our own surnames, but we were given names of our owners. So therefore, we could tell where you lived. And a lot of that still exists, a lot of it. But it was really interesting because, as I said, I got to the place where I started reflecting. Why? And I started bringing the past into the present because it is so significant. And how even back then you could identify people based on whose land they lived on. And a lot of that still occurs. With the enslaved, no birth certificates, no kind of identity, and they were not listed by name in census records until 1870. Did you all know that? 1870 was the first time we as Africans, African Americans were listed on slave records. So that's why when we look at what has happened in the past, we need to understand, we need to appreciate it so that we can honor our ancestors as opposed to condemning what they did, because as I said, you cannot minimize what happened during the period of enslavement. But at the same time, it still says where we must go and what is still needed. This is an example here of what Reconstruction era in Mars Bluff, and as I said, we're talking about the Wallace Gregg Plantation, because when we talk about that, we're talking about Francis Marion to a great extent. So, and, and as I said, it was very interesting to me because when you look at how much money, and it's not, you cannot see clearly here, but for those of us who are of age, I remember, we would pick cotton. And how much would we get for, if you could pick 100 pounds, you were doing real good. You were doing real good. Huh? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? See, that's why, and Mr. Durant, you just told your age, okay? But it's a reality. And as I said, there were so many customs and traditions that I learned based upon the project that I worked on. Information. So again, during Reconstruction, sharecropping, wage laborers, land labor, farm bills that were padded. You had people who could not read nor write. So if you can't read or write, how are you going to understand a labor agreement? How are you going to know what is equitable or what is fair? But this is what we had to endure. But still during the Reconstruction era, you do have in this area people who owned the land, and one of the persons whose father made sure that his family had land is the grandfather of Terry James, correct?
Third grade.
I didn't hear you.
Third grade grandfather.
Oh. Oh, okay, all right. But that says a lot too. Land ownership. So what we have here is just what's occurred in terms of land ownership and how it was passed down, so that we would know the significance of the contributions that were made by the enslaved population once Reconstruction came, the Civil War, then Reconstruction. We saw the vanishing of plantations and farms because the labor supply was no longer available. So here we just have how Francis Marion came to exist in the sense that the Wallace family initially gave the house that is currently the president's home, and then 100 acres of land. Now, I hope that I have given you some information that will be useful. This is a 24-slide PowerPoint that was based on a 31-page, including references, narratives. But then at the same time, it's brief. It's brief. But I came to a realization, as I said earlier, as to why people study and take time and are devoted to studying the history of a people, the history of a land, because all of it is very important. You cannot separate it. This area prospered because of the work of an enslaved population. It grew. But when that enslaved population gained some level of freedom, you saw the plantations and the farmlands diminishing. So that says a lot about the contributions that were made by a group of people. Contributions, again, that should not be forgotten but remembered. In my conclusion, and I'm saying this, the history of a land of people should always be written, told, and displayed, with the understanding that there are certain biases, prejudices, and perspectives that exist. But we don't need to erase history. We can't erase it. But the importance of history is that we learn from it. It won't be relived. We can't forget it. But we need to know so that it will not be relived. The sufferings of those who were enslaved on southern plantations and farms during the 18th and 19th centuries were many, and yet, despite these, they made invaluable contributions to the shaping and building of these United States. Therefore, their histories must be appreciated, learned, understood, documented, and reverenced because of what they had to endure. A challenge that I encountered was right now there are many websites, there are sources that are available for us to understand, for us to know what happened. But in so many instances, the information is secondhand or it has been retold. So with me trying to do some research, I found out that each one of us has a responsibility to record whom we are. There needs to be a recording so that future generations will have a better understanding of what happened and why, and not always look or frown upon what happened, but to learn from it and to grow. Thank you for your attentiveness.
Friends, we would like to now open the floor for at least maybe 2 or 3 questions that anybody may have for Ms. Pierce based on her presentation tonight.
Please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. One right here.
Okay, my name is Terry James. Born and raised in this area. Played on these grounds as a kid. And also, I thank you, Ms. Pierce. That was a lot of information,
But not enough.
but you just scratched the surface.
Yes,
You
yes.
just really scratched the surface. There's so much information about slavery, Reconstruction, from Native Americans all the way back to Revolutionary War. In this area, we're
Yeah.
rich, and some of us are afraid to tap into it, but I dump headfirst into it because it's so important that we
Yes.
save these sacred places like the Hewn Cabins, other sites that are in this area. We have to do a better job. My prayer is that we get funding from the state or the federal level to do more research in this area, because I'm telling you, there's so much information that's out here. It's just crazy. I'm telling you, like you said, it's so many sites out here. You can do research. I just found out maybe 6, 7 months ago that I had my first great-grandmother was Melissa Gregg. It blew me away. I said, oh, my God.
Yeah.
So there's so much you're learning each day You start researching, go on these sites, talk to people, people who've done research. Dr. Peter Woods, he said he came here. He wrote the book, The Black Majority. But you have to get into this stuff, people, and don't be afraid.
Right.
I talk a lot to people I don't know, groups of people, and the first thing I tell them, I'm not blaming you for what happened in slavery. I will not blame you for what happened in Reconstruction, Jim Crow, etc. But if your mindset is still the same, let's sit down and have a conversation.
Right.
And you'll find out we may be related. You never know. Anyway.
And one thing that, to add to what Terry was saying, I found out that there is a lot written about landowners. But when I tried to research the enslaved population, it was more complex. Yes, there are websites available now, but I found out, okay, Alexander Gregg, you know, he's not the only one, Alexander Gregg. You have to know, and Alexander Gregg is also, I don't want to get into that, but it was so much. You need to know birth dates, death dates, and you need to have an idea of where these people were born. Because when I tell you that there is much information, there is much information. And that's why I say we need to write our histories. We need to know. And there are so many fascinating discoveries that can be made. One thing, even too, learning about the old districts, the Marion district, the Darlington district. You were saying something? Right. It is overwhelming what you can learn. And as I said, look at these cabins as a beginning, a link, as it was stated here. Yes, Ms. Davis. Stand up. Oh.
Okay. My name is Gene Pierce, and a great presentation, but I wanted to bring something to bring us forward. You know, we talk about generational wealth, and a lot of us are seeing the wealth leave us.
Right.
We have a tendency to use an old law that nobody uses but us. It's called air property. And it's the gateway of you losing any land that we have. Now, try to remember this. There's probably the best organization in the country that will help you retain your land. It's called Heirs Property Preservation. It's in Charleston. You know, because I look around, we don't have a place to lay our head. So I just wanted to bring that forward so that we can understand that. Don't get a will and get away from heirs property. Call these people.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Ms. Pierce. Thank you, Ms. Pierce, for your information. But I hear you talk about what you didn't get when you were in school. We've got legislators now that are doing laws that are telling you that they don't want you to teach children about what you were just talking about. So now you're telling us what we should be doing, but we've got elected officials that are telling us just the opposite. So like a dear friend of mine, Fred Carter, says, if you go to him with a problem, don't come to me without until you got a solution as to how we're going to fix this. You know, that's where we are with this, because we're hearing it every day.
Mhm.
This is what they don't want to be told.
Right.
It's what you exactly told us that what happened tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One other thing I forgot. One thing about today's society, you may not want to teach it, but as long as you got those cell phones, kids you tell them not to do it, what a kid do. They do it anyway, so that'll resolve itself over time. The other thing I wanted to say was there's a lot of information, a lot of documents that's still in private hands. My prayer is that the people who have that information would turn it over to the archives, or turn it over to somebody so it can be taught. They have a lot of information about who you are. You may not know who you are,
Right.
but they got the document. Some of those documents still in private hands, in the attics, in the basement of some of these homes right now. And I kid you not. And it's another thing that I've learned in researching. It's called researching while black. Sometimes we get turned down, but I'm a digger. I'll send somebody look just like them and say, hey, I need this, and they'll get it for me. So there's a way around things. Don't be discouraged if you run into a brick wall. There's a lot of people out there to help you. But I'm serious about those documents that are still in these private hands. Please, ma'am, please, sir, have a conversation, your friends, your family, and for African Americans, anybody, talk with the elders. Interview them. You know, go to your local church, your barbershop, wherever. Talk with the elders, because they have some information you may not have. They know stuff that you may never know without talking with them, because it's not written down.
Right.
Hello. So I'm actually going to piggyback off of what you were just saying. So you did speak about the 14th Amendment and equal rights and everything like that. But how do we get to a point where the older generations and the younger generations have some type of common meeting ground to talk about slaveries and the impacts that it had, not just amongst blacks, but whites, Spanish, whatever. Because we have so many social movements that are going on in America right now that all piggyback off of what blacks had to endure to even get to the point to feel like, oh, I have a voice as a woman, I have a voice as a Latinx, I have a voice as someone part of LGBTQ. Like, how do we get to a point where we bridge that gap and we don't have, the, like you said, the sensational conversations, and we have the more informed conversations on both sides, whether it's whites that had to, their families having to deal with slavery, or blacks families having to deal with slavery? How do we get to that point?
Guess who has the answer?
Me? I don't have it. I don't No, I mean, I just think in general, it's really hard for younger generations to be, yeah, we can ask the elders in our families, but how do we have open, honest conversations with one another where it doesn't come from a sensationalized point of view of, oh, I'm black and I feel this way, or, oh, I'm white and you shouldn't feel this way, or whatever that looks like.
Good evening. I am a transplant, if you will, but I am a South Carolinian. I've lived in this area about 26 years in Dillon County, and I know a lot of people say I don't talk like I'm from here. Well, I'm from here, at least South Carolina. But to address the question that was posed by this young lady, be short and sweet. You start that conversation one-on-one with somebody, and just do that continually. And some people will recognize what you're doing, and they too will begin to do that. I think the problem that we have oftentimes is we see a problem, and we're looking at this great, big, old, gigantic problem. And therefore, we're overwhelmed in terms of approaches to solving that problem. Well, just start right where you are and begin the process, and just be persistent in that. And just share it with others. And you'll be surprised. It may take longer than you anticipate, but you'll be surprised at some of the outcomes that are produced.
One thing that I would like to add to that, and that's why I can say that this has really, I want to use the word profound experience for me, because it allowed me to engage in conversations with older people, with younger people, and I'm going to say with the black people and white people. Okay? To some extent, I want to use, I might have become obsessed because when I tell you that I was learning, and by engaging in conversations, you would be amazed at how many people want to talk, want to have conversations, and what you can learn. Even with me doing this project for this area, I'm originally from Darlington County, and I was digging into so much, so much. So as you put yourself out there, you start doing some things. You get to the place that you're obtaining information and you want to share, because I found myself doing that, and I had people coming at me, did you know this? Did you know that? I mean, people were actually going to libraries, finding information and telling me, no, I did not know that. That is good. But just with a little knowledge and understanding, you can engage people in conversations, and you can cause them to get at a place where I want to know more because I want to be better. I want to do better. I want to do more.
Ms. Pierce, hi. Thank you so much for being a dear friend, and this information you have brought to all of us, the masses here, was just phenomenal. My parents, they were transplants to Florence, but we reside in Mars Bluff, so all this information, and then also passing some of the historical pieces like, the Gregg cabins and so forth. I never knew any of this stuff.
That's what I'm saying.
But just reading the little markings, but that's limited information. So thank you so much. You have enlightened me, so I can therefore pass it on to those that I come in contact with, and especially my family.
And do the
Thank you.
research.
Also.
Do the research.
And
do,
as the gentleman,
do the research.
Exactly. And as the gentleman said here, as I've traveled, people always say, you don't sound like you were from South London, but I grew up right here. I was born here, but my parents, they were transplants to this particular area. Thank you.
Do the research.
Last question.
It's not a question, but I thought I was disheartened before, but I think I became enlightened with the young lady who was stating what she was stating when George Floyd happened, and you saw so many people coming together. Didn't matter what color, what race, and that, I think that has begun the conversation with people. And it's up to us to continue the conversations. You can do it one person at a time, one group at a time. Doesn't matter who they are. It's that you want to engage someone, because a lot of times people want to know, but they're scared to ask. You have people, and then some of us become offended by a question that someone of another race asks us. And then that stops the conversation altogether. Then how can they learn if you can't ask a question without being offended? You're teaching them something that they wanted to know, that they questioned in their mind. And then they can respect where our preconceptions come from, why we act the way we do, what our cultures are. I can then begin to ask you about yours, why you feel the way you do. I just feel like people need to get away from saying, I cannot ask you this question without being offended.
Right.
But I mean, I think, I'm sorry, I know you said that was the last question, but I feel like that's also a tough question, because I don't feel like as a Black person, it's my job to teach you someone of another race. You have this, you're offered the same information as me. So I just like you said, the gentleman said earlier, you have a smartphone, you can go on Google and find out the same information I can. So I can't teach you the shared history that we have. I can probably give you my perspective on what I've learned, but you can also give me your perspective on what you've learned, but we both learned the same thing.
We did both learn the same thing, because I'm not living your life.
Yeah.
And express what you feel, and we could come to some mutual agreement about, now I'm beginning to understand, and that may cause someone to say, I want to further learn.
Yeah.
And I'm going to not just have a preconceived notion of what I was taught while I was growing up. Because racism is not something that just happens. You're taught it. So if you're taught something, you can be taught not to be that way also. So if everybody takes a little bit of time to just engage each other, maybe you'll find that we're more alike than more different.
Absolutely.
What I want to add to this, you said Google. Google provides you with, and I'm going to say it, superficial information. But because you can go, going to museums, going to South Carolina Department of Archives and History, these places now have digitized information. So we want to deal with facts, and that information is available. So yes, Google will lead you to other sources. But as I said, we want to deal with facts. And see, that is one thing that was pointed out, in the sense that so much information is retold, and it's not accurate because of biases. Even when I was doing my research, okay, because of who wrote it, I don't need that. There were too many biases, too much prejudice. So that's why we go to sources that will give us documented information.
Friends, we'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. If you look at your program, you'll notice there is a QR code on the program. If you click on that, it will take you to Yvette's written document that has many more details than what we were able to fit into the presentation tonight. It is a story about the movement of land from one family to another, the ways in which the physical cabins themselves have been moved. But I think the underlying story, as Yvette has hit throughout the presentation tonight, is it is one of perseverance, endurance, and ultimately hope. Have a great evening and drive safe.